I thank you for joining me in this video as we continue on this study of the Gospel of Matthew. We are going to be looking at Matthew chapter 22 and verses 41 to 46, and I will be reading out of the original Revised Standard Version. Chapter 22, verse 41. Now, while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them a question, saying, "What do you think of the Christ? Whose son is he?" They said to him, "The son of David." He said to them, "How is it then that David, inspired by the Spirit, calls him Lord, saying, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I put my enemies under thy feet'? If David thus calls him Lord, how is he his son?" And no one was able to answer him a word, nor from that day did anyone dare to ask him any more questions. It is now late in the ministry of Jesus. Jesus had been cautious about who and what he was early in his ministry. He was careful as to what people said of him. The current concern was not so much with what was said of him, but with how he would be perceived. Excuse me. The concern was not so much with what was said of him, but with how that perception could be used to, well, put him in the wrong sort of light. Jesus was not concerned with the fact that people knew he was Messiah, but rather the concern was what people understood by that term and what they meant. Jesus was not just using the Messiah as the promised one, the Holy One of God. Jesus, you see, was Messiah on his terms. And if you think about it, that's always true. Jesus is concerned that we accept him on his terms. It's not what we make of the terms. The issue that Jesus had is that people were willing to use him to further their agendas, and Jesus was not about to be a part of it. Jesus did not give in to the plans and wishes of the people. You see this in his apostles, whom he brought along very slowly in the faith. In the portion of scripture, you see where the caution of earlier times is gone. Jesus can see the end is at hand, and as it were, that lid of secrecy can be lifted and he can begin to explore a bit more deeply who and what he is. So Jesus is challenging the Pharisees on their understanding of who the Messiah was. The quotation of Psalm 110 here says that the Messiah was Lord. In particular, note the stress that Jesus puts on the fact that David was speaking in the Spirit. Jesus is not saying that the scripture said as much as the Spirit says in the scripture that David calls the Messiah Lord. And the expectation of the day and the understanding of the day, the Messiah would be said to be a king that reasserts Israel's place in the world. Jesus is pointing to the fact that the Messiah would be much more than a king. Jesus is not saying it, but it seems to be assumed or implied that he is talking of himself. In other words, if you were present there would be a measure of ambiguity within this. Jesus was not saying right out this is who he was, but he was laying it out in such a way you couldn't help but think that's where he was referring to. Now, Jesus was not free at this time to come out and say this to the Pharisees. He knew that he would provoke a reaction from them if he did, and he was not ready to do so. The time for that would come. See Matthew chapter 26 and verses 63 and 64. Yet Jesus was being far more direct than he was at the beginning of his ministry. Jesus was only too aware of the fact of the fate that awaited him at the end of the week. The reality is that even in our day and age, that the issue is not so much about the person Jesus as the claims about Jesus. People are willing to accept the reality of Jesus as long as you leave out certain elements of the story. This is why there is that persistent mistruth that says the early church deified Jesus. You know, it is kind of funny to think about it because church councils since and church committees since have never been known to be really coming to an agreement on much of anything. And the idea that a group of people in the early church could sit down and go, okay, next on the order of business is we got to make Jesus God. It doesn't really speak well of history, and more to the point, is not very realistic about what any committee could do. You know, the early church saw Jesus as God because that was there from the very beginning. It was clear and evident that this was God in the flesh. Yes, they had to hammer out and understand what that meant in terms of terminology and practical implications. Look at our text here. What Jesus himself does is quote David saying that the Messiah was Lord. Remember, Lord in the context of Judaism meant God. Jewish sensibilities did not allow for the calling of God by his name. And so Lord would be used instead. We can reduce Jesus to a teacher or a prophet or whatever, and people will accept him because he is no longer a threat. Jesus is Lord. This is the first creed of the Christian church. It is the foundation for all Christian truth. Jesus is Lord. He has risen from the dead, and he is